Hallelujah. 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 Hallelujah.
I count everything else as garbage so that Christ may be my wealth.
Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
May Christ be with you.
And also with you.
A reading from the Good News according to the book of Luke.
Glory to you, O Christ.
As the time approached when he was to be taken from this world, Jesus firmly resolved to proceed toward Jerusalem and sent messengers on ahead. They entered a Samaritan town to make preparations for him, but the Samaritans would not welcome Jesus because his destination was Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, "Rabbi, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy them?" But Jesus turned and reprimanded them. Then they set off for another town. As they were making their way along, they met a fellow traveler who said to Jesus, "I will be your follower wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have lairs, the birds of the sky have nests, but the chosen one has nowhere to rest." To another, Jesus said, "Follow me." The traveler replied, "Let me bury my father first." Jesus said in return, "Let the dead bury their dead. You go and proclaim the reign of God everywhere." Yet another traveler approached Jesus in this way, "I will be your follower, Rabbi, but first let me say goodbye to my people at home." Jesus answered, "Whoever puts a hand to the plow but keeps looking back is unfit for the reign of God." This is the gospel of Christ.
Praise to you, O Christ.
In Emmaus, we don't often disrupt the predictable cycle of proper Sundays with saints. Ironically, disrupting what's predictable and proper is pretty much what saints do. Maybe I should start with what saints are and are not. Saint just means sanctus, santo, saint, holy. Saints are purely human. There's nothing unearthly about their core, although sometimes it gathers around them. And angels are very different. They're just called saints. It's a title thing for them. Real saints are real humans, limited, mortal, flailing and failing, flawed. Because of this, making a difference on that scale means they allowed their flawed human, mortal, earthly life to be used by God. So saints get remembered as examples of doing it mostly right. There are many who think of saints as remaining a presence, a limited influence, and encouragement. In fact, the normal process of proving sainthood for the Roman Catholic Church requires continuing their interventions posthumously. We don't pray to saints like we pray to God. Many of us ask them for inspiration and support or what to do, but that's sort of like the way that we continue to ask our parents and elders even when they're not there. That doesn't make it worship. And it's wrong to mistake a particularly clear channel of the gift for that gift's source. St. Paul had it right. We are not of one or another human. We are of Christ. Now, the ECC is into family, not dogma. Doesn't ask us to believe or not believe in this or that saint as anything more than examples. In fact, we know that many of those early saints didn't ever really exist. In those cases, there was an edifying story, and a person kind of got built around that. St. Sophia is a good example. St. Christopher is a comforting one. And then sometimes we have a lot of verified facts and a whole whack of made-up stuff about a saint. And that's the situation with Francis of Assisi. We know lots of facts about him. We have several of his letters to different people. We have the somewhat less useful biographies of the people who wrote shortly after his death, many of whom knew him. But, of course, they wrote with their agendas. Then we have the myths and the misunderstandings, and frankly, the 800 years of Franciscan impact on the Western Church. Should I tell you that our closing hymn, our most favorite Francis quote, first showed up about World War I? But you know, for all I know, Francis did inspire the writer, and the writer was giving correct attribution. We also have the people who'd rather simplify him into the singing hippie saint, or the nature saint, or the eco saint, and put him in a box or in the garden. A trivialization that leads to bird baths and feeders and other safely immobile statuary. The real-life St. Francis didn't wake up one morning with the whole Franciscan future stretching before him. He was the son of a well-off cloth merchant with visions of being wealthy and generous, so he acted like a shallow partying dude. Then he was captivated by visions of martial glory. He wanted to be glorious. So he went to war against the next town over, was injured and captured, spent a year in a dungeon, which gave him bouts of malarial fever for the rest of his life, and ended those martial dreams, and gave him a lot of time to think. He came back very different, but not yet saintly. His conversion process was long and step by step. He wandered off a lot up into the hills and around town. He did a fair bit of contemplation and prayer, we think, but things didn't get serious until two incidents you've probably heard of. There was when he kissed a leper after previous Francis would literally ostentatiously hold his nose 2 miles away from their camp. And there's the story of God talking to him in that rundown church of San Damiano. Told him to rebuild the church. Now, for the first one, I think it's no bad idea to run at the thing that scares you, but you know what to do anyway. Think of it as sort of the charitability polar bear plunge. I'm going to get over my hang up and go for it, sir. The second story is the one that gets my attention more. I wear the San Damiano cross as a reminder to understand exactly what I've been called to do. Otherwise, I might find myself investing more in mortar than mores. That's an important teaching for me. Now, I'll explain the bird bath thing, but briefly, and I think you'll enjoy it, the actual background of it. You see, early on, he was preaching in town, and they were blowing him off like you blow off every street preacher. But he's an impetuous young man. So he loudly declared that if the town folk were going to ignore him, he was darn well going to preach to the birds. The birds settled and quieted and listened to him, which, funny enough, got the townsfolk's attention. The incident was a favorite art subject because the common folk saw themselves in the birds. There was this whole class thing about what birds mean which, and you'll see all that in this art about him preaching to the birds. But it's really about preaching to who will listen and hoping the other ones catch a little bit on the edge. So the last bio bit on this saint I want to talk about is conversions. A wolf, a pope, and a sultan. You may have heard me say that I make a lousy Franciscan, but I make a pretty good St. Francis's wolf. Well, Francis moved to the town of Gubbio, and there was a wolf that had come out of the hills and was eating sheep and terrorizing the populace. So Francis asked to go talk to the wolf, and he goes out of town and everyone follows him because this is going to be good one way or the other. We're either going to have a great eating or we're going to have a great preaching. And the wolf charges at him and he rebukes it and says, hey, in the name of Christ, knock that off. And then he walks with the wolf and explains to the wolf that these town folk need the sheep to live. And he brokers a peace agreement. Wolf's not going to eat the sheep, not going to freak out the townspeople. And in exchange, the townspeople will feed him. Win-win, right? So the wolf ended up the town's protector. There's a whole bunch of statues. I'm just slightly fond of them. And there's a church plaque on the site where this supposedly happened that refers to Francis persuading the pernicious wolf. I love the idea of Francis persuading a pernicious wolf. Then there's the fearless way that Francis just walked right up to intimidating people. The bishop in his town was going to hold basically an intervention because Francis was doing this holy man stuff and really worrying his dad and probably impacting his dad's respect in town. Francis walks up on him, and by the end of that encounter, has the bishop's permission to go be a holy man. Then Francis gathers several friars, walks to Rome, walks up on the Pope through however many papal guards and functionaries. And this is not just any Pope. This is Innocent III. He had a lot of power and a lot of presence. Francis took the rebuke so well that he got Innocent to agree to the friars' unrealistic, impractical, wandering order and permission to preach. Later, Francis's recovery plan from 4 years of being basically bedridden the entire time was to just walk to the Holy Land, walk up into the Saracen camp, walk up on Sultan al-Kamil, and somehow not get killed on the way. And while he didn't get the peace agreement he was looking for, he got a meeting of the hearts, a meeting of the souls with this other mystic man. And there's really no earthly excuse for how Francis kept getting to and then getting to these important, powerful people who had a very different internal take on him. Francis was a lot of contradictions too. Everything he did and preached condemned the church's corrupt power. Yet he also preached that priests should be respected, not because they were doing anything respectful outside of Mass, but because through their flaws, that was still the way to get to Mass and in just go. He had a deep obedience to the Pope who mocked his dirtiness, enough that he converted that Pope. He gathered a movement that resulted in 10,000 Franciscans and Clares in his lifetime. And yet he got removed from authority and sidelined for a significant chunk of that. And it was only partly due to his health. He had a temper. But he'd come to the brother he chewed out and humble himself and apologize abjectly. Francis was human. Francis felt things deeply, reached farther than his body could support. He hung between visions of God's greatness and everything's beauty and his own self-condemnation. And no, for the record, I don't think he would have been medicated out of his sanctity. In fact, I don't think even bird baths can conquer him. He teaches a lesson even there. Hands humbly full, well, full of whatever comes into them, birdseed, water, the frog, a squirrel, whatever. Safe shelter, nourishment, a bit of God's fool fooling around. But here's the challenge. Wouldn't we learn more if we brushed the snow off his shoulders, brought him inside, and filled those hands with the songs and stumbles and challenges Francis really gives?